Good Wednesday morning. Today, John is speaking about hope for the young. He just got done with a trip to Mobile, and he came back from that, and he has some insights that he wants to share. So here we go.
It was a lovely trip, apart from the fact that when I got back, I found I'd got Omicron. So I was laid aside for a few days, and then my wife, of course, got it. So she's just recovering. She was determined that the end was nigh, as people are when they have these things. But I think she's now returned to the land of the living. So heaven is not yet for her, but it feels like that at times. I've never had a cough quite like it. Wasn't that febrile? I mean, it didn't feel like malaria or anything like that, but not nice. But the trip on overall was beautiful. One of the most enjoyable I've ever had. It began straight away by realizing just how connected things are. Because in the first session, a couple turned up who I've stayed with before, but currently her mother's got dementia and they're having stuff done to their house, so I wasn't staying with them. But they turned up at the first session, and the surgeon made a comment. He said, you guys in the audience are probably not aware because you were still in short trousers, so to speak, when we first came across John Patrick. And it turned out it was my first ever visit to Focus on the Family's Physician Conference. I think closing that conference was an utterly incomprehensible action on the part of Focus when James Dobson retired. I mean, it was such a superb conference. But anyway, they'd gone along and they'd looked at the long list of people speaking. Nobody knew me from Adam at that point. But Kelly, the wife of the family, said, that looks like an interesting title. And she's a great enthusiast, and she decided she was going to be enthusiastic about me that week. And so a modest attendance at the first one and full for the second. And now I realise it's probably Kelly's doing. It also meant when they went back that they decided they had to do something more for the medical community's Christian faith in Mobile. They invited me down there to do that. So the guy who's been working for them for years discovered, as I did at that moment, that in an indirect sort of way, I had paved the way for his salary, which is rather sweet. But things said in one place turn up in another, and only God knows how the connections are made. They're so tenuous, but so strong. So that was a lovely start. But then to have, 50 or 60 students et al., in a not very comfortable environment, because it's a summer camp which is let to them free at this time of year, and they bring their own food, and it's all a bit ad hoc, and you sleep in a cabin designed for the summer, so you put about 6 sleeping bags around you and you're fine. But what was delightful to me is that I've come across quite a few students and a lot of my colleagues who are talking about how flat emotionally students are at the moment. Well, these weren't. They were not bubbling or anything like that, but they were seriously wanting to talk and to be talked to. There's hope. Perhaps the moment that made it clearest for me was a sort of ad hoc extra fitted into the program with a bunch of guys, about 10 of them, and they just wanted to talk about reading. Now, here there were medical students, and a couple of them admitted they hadn't read anything, perhaps other than their Bible, unrelated to medicine since they'd entered medical school. That's utterly unacceptable. I mean, this is what's happening to their soul. Well, what's happening to their soul is it's shriveling. And we've been run through COVID by people like that who probably never read anything of any great importance about what it means to be human. And so they looked at COVID through the epidemiological stats and reduced everyone to mere numbers. And it was an unprecedented disaster. So we started talking about books, and it was deeply moving to realize these guys had been robbed of their heritage. School has lost its way, and it was very sad to watch them come to terms. And I'm sure a reading group is going to come out of it. I got back, and just passing on this view, Sally had come across a Victor David Hansen article on in the City Journal, talking about the death of the classical education program, and that it's leaving the university and going to go outside it because people are hungry for it. I know from what has happened to me over the years that it is not true that it's all over for Christianity. Instead, quite the opposite is happening, but it's a serious form. They realise it's not going to be easy, not at all. But they realise it's the only answer out there. The hysterics that go on in the woke world have got to come to an end. The failure of the New Zealand Prime Minister, the ultimate example of the virtue signalling female hero who's now decided that she can't win the next election, so rather than lose, she'll leave it to someone else. Douglas Murray's take on her is worth listening to. He's an astute observer. We all know that there are some people we trust, but not as many as we would wish. And in medicine, you know perfectly well, wherever I go, I can say to people, I can ask an audience and say, if I was to ask you all to give me the top internists, the top surgeons in town, would I get a random scattering of names? And the answer, of course, is no. There are very few doctors in each town, and they don't come up on who's the best whatever on the internet. Quite often, they, shall we say, are somewhat lacking in social skills, but everybody knows they do their job better than anyone else. And ultimately, that's why you need a family practitioner and someone like that between you and the endpoint, because they are only concerned with competence. They're not concerned with virtue signaling, which is what's dominant in our world at the moment, and it can't last. So hopefully that will show. I always point out to people, especially the young, that good things are not laid out like a smorgasbord where you take what you want from what's on the table. They are fundamentally hierarchical, which is what Jordan Peterson understands to a considerable degree. I don't agree with him entirely about the hierarchy, because from the point of view of culture, you can divide cultures in the world into two with one question. Do you live in a culture where truth dominates loyalty, or a culture where loyalty trumps truth? Now, we're just seeing this at the moment in Canada with ministers who clearly come from cultural backgrounds that put loyalty over truth, so they have rewarded their friends when they got into power. And they would see nothing wrong with that, because that's normal for all except Jewish and Christian cultures. Now we play games, not making it too obvious in the usual British cynical, polite approach, but nevertheless, that difference actually matters. Truth, when it's top, means competence is top. Loyalty, when it's top, means your, what should I say, I used to say Rolodex, but your list of contacts is top. Competence, it hardly shows at all. And we can see it everywhere where incompetence is taking over because of connections instead of the people who should be doing it. We need to go back to a regular reading of Lewis's Abolition of Man, the lovely passage at the end of the first chapter. For the wise men of old, the Middle Ages, the cardinal problem of human life was how to conform your soul to objective reality, namely God. And the solution was wisdom, self-discipline, and virtue, a virtue list in which truth would be top. But for the modern man, the cardinal problem of human life is how to conform the world to our desires, and the solution is technique. Technique is not as great as it's cracked up to be if it's not controlled by real virtues, the ancient ones. Technique can make you look like what you're not, can't it? One-on-one conversation, it's harder to maintain. And that's why we need to think about that a lot more, and it will do the church a lot of good, because that's what the church is about. Face-to-face meetings where people begin to deal with the issues that matter most of all to them. That's what I watched in Mobile last weekend. The weekend before, the one that's just gone. There was a seriousness which is really, it's not that common. They were a bit perhaps intimidated by me to begin with, but they warmed very quickly. I guess they don't meet many people who've read as much as I have. And yet, that should have been the case for everyone. I mean, the only thing you really need to do with a child early on is get them reading, not looking at screens. The difference between the word and the image is hugely important. When you look at an image, what you see is what you get. And you get all these attempts to look like the image on Instagram and goodness knows where. The female sex seems to be particularly devoted to all looking the same, because when I go into a magazine shop, I can walk past all those female orientated magazines, and to me it looks like the same person on every cover. They're all trying to look like some imagined ideal, which doesn't, of course, exist. Now, when you listen to stories, it's entirely different, because now your imagination is involved. And for children, their imaginations are wonderful to watch, and you don't want to wreck them. Somewhere Chesterton points out how excited they are about the world early on. It says you can read a story to a small child, and even they got into the room and there was a door. And the child is excited about the fact that there's a door. Well, yes, because everything is new, everything is exciting, and they're already building their own pictures, so to speak, in their heads. But it's theirs. Sally and I both remember running home from school to get home in time for the 5 o'clock children's hour on BBC radio. There was no television. Read by wonderfully talented actors who brought stories to life for us, and then we populated them. We all knew what they were from our point of view. So a child's imagination is dramatically more stimulated by story than it is by picture books. The sooner you get to the story and beyond the pictures, the sooner you've got a child who's ready to take off. And they love the story so much, they have them word perfect. You try to shorten them, they'll be on your case immediately. And the fun you can have as a family when you can actually pretend you don't know a story that you do, just to see if they're awake. And of course they always are, especially Bible stories. So a Bible picture book is nowhere near as rich as Bible stories are. And I've had that particular episode replay in my life time and time again. A Visit with Mrs. G is the website that I used to use. Mrs. G has moved on now, but many years ago now, she realised she's a pastor's wife in Toronto, but she realised that there were opportunities in China and many so-called lockdown countries that she could use, because they all wanted material for English as a second language. English is the language of the world, particularly the scientific world. So if you're going to make it in that area, you've got to talk that language. So she'd got a wonderful Welsh-speaking voice, and she simply retold the Bible stories with good, clear diction and a suitable vocabulary, and she would send them free to English as a second language programs in places like China and all over the place. And so her voice is known in many countries that were denying missionaries while allowing Mrs. G in with the Bible stories, which are the ultimate means of mission. And over the years, I've introduced people in the US and elsewhere who became some of them very enamored of Mrs. G, and pointed out that you should sell them in the US. We don't mind paying for them so that you can keep going. Up till that point, whenever she got an order and she didn't have the money, she'd assemble her prayer group and they'd pray the money in to send it. But over the years, I would get regular Mrs. G stories relayed to me when I was traveling around the country. And they were beautiful, how children responded to these stories. Well, one little guy loved Mrs. G so much, his parents got him a little tape recorder, as it was in those days, and he would get up in the morning before the rest of the family so that he could have a visit with Mrs. G, his granny on the tape, who read stories to him beautifully, and that ultimately will have an effect on his life, because those stories provide us with a moral compass for the rest of our world. So narrative matters, and we need to recognize just how important that is in child rearing. And those screens have got to go. I mean, if you care about your kids, the evidence is overwhelming now that it's dramatically diminishing their attention span and ruining their education. Now, this trip to Mobile actually was really astonishing to me, is that they were actually out of range of for their phones. There was only one place apparently where you could pick it up, so we were in contact, but the organizer didn't tell them that. And I asked them, I haven't seen you fiddling with your phones. They said, it's not available. And I asked them, are you missing them? They said, oh, yes, but it doesn't matter. Now, normally it wouldn't have been like that. There are plenty of studies now of taking kids from Ivy League schools on a weekend retreat somewhere, not a Christian one, taking their phones away from them, and they were begging for them within hours. We have a whole society that will fall apart if we take down all the phones. Just think what that means to an enemy who wants to do that. Helicopter parenting and all the rest becomes impossible at that point. The world existed without this before. It can exist without them again. And you'll get much more independent and important outcomes. We are failing in the imaginative area of science at the moment. The part higher and deeper part, the PhD part of science, you're just crossing T's and dotting I's for somebody else's benefit. It's not until you get to being, even beyond postdoc in many cases, that you're allowed to let your own imagination direct where you will go and what you will do. And that needs to be understood, because that's when really important things happen. You can stop me if I've already done this on this podcast, because it struck me so strongly that I've talked about it in quite a few places now. But there is an absolutely beautiful piece on YouTube from Michael Faraday's day in which he discovered the electric motor. And they've made the video in the lecture theatre where Michael Faraday worked, in the building where Michael Faraday worked. And this lovely American has reproduced this day. And it's very interesting, a particular point I'm discussing at the moment, that Michael Faraday was not educated. And the big loss for him, but not for us, was that he was weak in mathematics, but he was a brilliant experimenter. And so instead of being controlled by the sense of the power of mathematics that was dominant in the 18th century, he had to use his incredible ability to see that other people missed. So he went to his lab on that day in September, and he noticed that when electricity was passed through wires under certain circumstances, he could see a little sort of movement. Now, no, everybody else was straight line thinkers because that's the way the mathematics had worked up till that point. But he was sure he could see something important. Anyway, by the end of the day, what he had done, without any mathematics at all, was invented the electric motor in one day. And then, being the Christian man that he was, he made a little model of it to demonstrate it and sent it to all the major scientists of the day who were therefore aware of this phenomenon that they'd all missed and Michael Faraday had seen. Now, the more we insist on having PC approaches to everything, that kind of inventiveness, there's no space for it. And Peter Thiel, who's trying to get young people with smart ideas to leave university, and he's paying them to do it because he's aware that imagination is failing. We're doing applied technology. You can tell a technologist what to do because in principle it's doable. But the more important science, you can't do that because until someone thinks about it, you can't even conceive of it. You can't have a technological program to invent the wheel. The moment you think about it, it's in principle so simple that you don't need a program of any sort. And yet it was a long while before we invented the wheel. But once you thought about a wheel, that was it. There wasn't any research, no government funding required. Now, you have to excuse me, I'm going to sneeze, sorry. The only bit of COVID that hangs on is the throat doesn't come back to normal moisture at the right speed. But back to imagination. Imagination is very, very important. Now, the area of education where I think it shows up most beautifully is the love of rhythms that children have. They love to jig around and they love nursery rhymes, and they're perfectly capable of loving poetry, but we don't teach it anymore. I find people are so ignorant about great poetry. It is beyond belief. So I've said this before, but I want people to do it, to go and get George Herbert's collection of poems and read them. They will serve your soul in very good ways. That's why the Psalms are central to Jewish worship and should be to ours. And they used to be until relatively recently. And they need to come back. I read the Psalms. I try to do it every day. I don't always do it. One of the things that this COVID episode did was knock out my ability to even read a book for a few days. So all that's just coming back. But the Psalms are so good in that they're beautiful and that the rubber hits the road. They're not structured such as a reductionistic teacher would want. And different phrases are going to hit you in different ways at different times. I mean, when Psalm 19 talks about their voice being heard in all the earth, but a really reductionist say they have no voice. Well, no, not in the sense that you want to limit the word, but everybody with an ounce of poetry in their soul knows exactly what's going on. That you look at the world and stand back for a moment from all your prejudices. Just enjoy it. The 6-foot icicles that were hanging outside my window yesterday with the sun shining through them. There's no scientific way of looking at that. If you don't see the beauty of it, then you're missing something in your soul. So anybody who goes out into, many people say, yeah, I worship in nature because I can't do it in church, and that's a sad statement, but Wendell Berry comes in that category and has said so. But poetry can do that. Those phrases come to your mind. I woke up yesterday morning with a phrase in my head, and I had to go and look up where it came from. All shall be well. All manner of things shall be well. I knew that was a quotation, but I didn't know where it was. It didn't take long. It's Julian of Norwich in the 14th century. Where did that come from at that point? You know, I was just recovering from COVID. What a lovely thought to wake up with. And she was an anchorite. She lived in one cell attached to the church for the last half of her life and wrote amazing material, which is still available. We need our souls to be enriched in that way. So when you read the Psalms every day, what you're doing is putting it there, especially if you do it with children, they'll retain it all. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, when you need it, a phrase will come up. And now, at least, one good thing about the internet, you can put a phrase into Google and you'll get to it in most cases. Not all. It's interesting what you can't get to. I mean, obviously, it's only when you find it by some other route that you know it's not there. If you put into Google, where was slavery first banned and on what date, you will not get the right answer. They're suppressing it because it was banned in England at the beginning of the 12th century when Anselm, shortly before he died, persuaded the church in England that it was unacceptable to have slaves, and they passed the rule. So there was no slavery in England from way back then. Now, that doesn't fit the narrative of how slavery is supposed to be at the moment. Again, we would only have brought into the narrative if we were utterly lacking in imagination. To maintain that slavery is only white on black is really ridiculous. I mean, where do they think the word slave came from? It came from Slavic. There were no black slaves in Europe for many, many years because we didn't get south of the equator, and we certainly didn't get any further, east or west. The early slaves were taken from the Balkans because they were weak and vulnerable and they could be enslaved. The Brits were enslaved by Norsemen and the like. The very word should tell you that your current way of looking at it is it's culturally without depth. So it was really interesting to begin to talk to these young people. I had very much, sadly, the sense of the old men at the Second Temple. The young people had not seen the first temple, the old men had. And so when the new temple was consecrated, all the young people were dancing and celebrating, but the old men wept because they had seen the first temple. And in the first temple, God's presence came down on it in an overwhelming way. Nothing like that happened with the second temple. That's why the old men wept. That's a phenomenon that I had this weekend again, as I realized that most of them could not even conceive of my undergraduate experience of university, where most Sundays I would hear an hour-long sermon and sometimes another one on Friday night. That's almost unheard of these days. But what was really sad was thinking the preacher who had most impact on me was Martin Lloyd-Jones, who preached in a place called Westminster Chapel. So just this week, Sally and I, we found one on YouTube on Romans 8, which just took us back. It was beautiful. But we wondered what was happening at Westminster Chapel, and we went back to found they have a website, of course. There is no mention of Martin Lloyd-Jones anywhere on the website. It's as though he never existed. This man had a major impact on student life. usually 1,000 students were listening to him on Sunday night. And he preached all through the war up until about 1960, 20 years. That's a lot of people. I meet people all over the world who were impacted by him, in that horrible use of the word impact, sorry, very bad English. But his impact was huge. I can even remember sitting in the office of a professor of medicine in Ibadan in Nigeria. And I saw them, Martin Lloyd's books, Lloyd Jones's books on his shelf, and I commented on them. He said, nobody reads them now. And sadly, it's not quite true. There are recordings out there, but it is so sad that somebody who had that kind of impact is no longer, I think the correct term is that he is no longer accessible to the modern student. We've got to start further back to get them there. They will listen more easily than they will read, and they don't write well, and now the new AI stuff is going to make it unnecessary for them to do that. That means the love of beautiful cadences in literature, that's a great loss, and I don't know what we can do about it, but Victor Davids Hansen gave me some hope this week in that he thinks that the classics departments that are being closed down all over the country to save money will be reopened independently for small groups initially, but the need is there. And the fact that Victor Davids Hansen can draw the audiences he does as a classicist is wonderful. Agreed, his major interest is military history in the ancient world as well. But he has a huge following, along with several others who are fellows at the Hoover Institute in Stanford. So I had the privilege of, I guess, pouring water out of the desert. I mean, they soaked it up in quite an extraordinary fashion. It'll be interesting to see whether it has any longer-term impact. But I don't think I ever left a conference. At the end of it, we finished at Saturday afternoon, and I think most of the students there came and thanked me more than once on the way out before they left. That's extraordinary. You expect a few of them to have had a weekend that mattered to them, but almost without exception, they came and said thank you. And I guess it's because that sense that learning could actually matter to you in an important and ongoing way was an extraordinary idea for them. I don't think they can remember a single lecture or sermon that they've ever heard that they can remember in some detail, whereas I've got dozens in that category. Important lectures in medical school, because they were not given because somebody had written a curriculum and was ticking off their little boxes, but because you were by the side of a patient's bed and the teacher was brilliant and realized this was a teaching moment, that he could make you see more clearly what you needed to thoroughly understand. I still remember episodes like that I carried with me for the rest of my life. I can't talk about the classification of renal disease without immediately having in my head the first person to show me how it could be done. That sort of thing, I don't think exists anymore. We are dying in intellectual terms. No, it can come to life again. There are bits of hope on that. The incredible success of Pride and Prejudice and the other Jane Austen movies over the last little while, it gives me hope. It's very amusing for us, actually, that we gained another son in our family from the Rwanda War, and Sally sent him to me, and eventually we got him to Ottawa as a refugee, and he's now well established as a lawyer in Ottawa. But shortly after he arrived, although when he arrived he didn't speak English, if we went out for a dinner or something like that, and we came back late in the evening, it was quite likely that Victor would be watching the BBC film of Pride and Prejudice, the 6-part one. Here's a young man from Rwanda who just loved Pride and Prejudice. And we talked about it, and of course it was the 18th century in that class was a mannered time in which people behaved with ritual courtesy, which still happened in Rwanda, was like that. So he could relate to 18th century Britain better than he could to 20th century Canada, 21st century Canada. So there's hope when that barrier can be crossed. I mean, the lovely line when Elizabeth and Darcy realize the truth about them, and Darcy says to Elizabeth, "You must have thought me devoid of all proper sentiment." Now, that's a sentence which would be meaningless to most people today. What on earth is he talking about? Proper sentiment? What you feel is who you are. There's nothing proper or improper about it. Oh, yes, there is, in that world. But, of course, once you lose the sense of the fall, the idea that there could be proper and improper sentiment becomes unthinkable. It's only because we are, in Chesterton's lovely phrase, to keep reminding people lovely phrases exist, we are the survivors of a colossal wreck that went down before the beginning of time, or at the beginning of time. He's talking about the fall. And because of that, all sorts of other things become not only important, but possible. I mean, in paradise before the fall, they were innocents. It was innocent, completely innocent, childlike. But God knew that the fall was going to come, and since his objective was to have beings who could love him and he could love them because of what they know about the relationship over time, he looked and said, let history roll. And it's still rolling. And in the end, we're going to say, Lord, it's all been good. All manner of things shall be well. And we have a deep intuition that that is in fact the case. But those who are brought up in the modern world, where they say science is all, I mean, the COVID thing, people who knew nothing about science said, we're just following the science. No, you're following a few grossly reductionistic scientists and not able to find out the good ones, the best ones, who got it right, of course. So that sense went through the whole weekend, and teaching discipleship in that context. And whenever I do it, and I do it every time I find an audience who doesn't know this and take them through the Sermon on the Mount, especially the Beatitudes, it is a joy to see the power of our Lord's words.
John, you talked about children and televisions earlier on in the talk. Let me paint a picture for you, and you could tell me what you'd recommend. So I'm going to talk about my family and some rhythms that we currently have. So I resisted a TV for a long time, hearing you back in high school. I remember Mark Grubb, who introduced me to you, got me to that. And I was pretty proud of that. But then phones and computers came along that just kind of replaced television. With that being said, we also did buy a TV. We have a basement, and we put it down in the basement. And the way that we use that is we play exercise videos on it on YouTube. Me and my wife exercise. But the way that it interacts with the kids is we will do a movie night on Friday night. Also, we host a group for our church, And when the adults are upstairs, we find it easy to put the children downstairs on a movie. And when that movie turns off, it turns into chaos and the adults can't talk. So what would you say to me? Do I need to sell my television?
You're in the position of choosing the lesser evils. So the most important thing is going to be training people how to use these machines, because they are, as far as I'm concerned, the invention of the devil, but we can't bypass them now. You cannot fly to the States without a cell phone now. I need one. I can't do without it. That really does upset me, but there's no way around that. You don't have to have a television, but for sports, it can be very good. That's a relatively innocent use of time. So I'm not going to be as clear-cut as I was in the past. We were blessed, there's no question about that, not to have a television in our family as a major feature, ever.
So that's something I could do. I could remove that television.
Well, I don't know whether it's still possible. My children they've all moved to videos because that's a better control. And certainly the ones that grew up in Africa have been blessed in that because they had good videos. So I think I've told you that the three children from Africa know the whole of Much Ado About Nothing. They can join in the play when they're watching it, as we found out when we did it in our open-air theatre here, and the actors quickly realised that these three kids knew every word of the play because the Kenneth Branagh version is beautifully done and is worth having. So there are films out there that I think one could use. They're not a great many for me, but top of my list would be A Man for All Seasons. If you haven't shown that to your adult group, there's two versions. The older one with Paul Scofield and the later one with the American actor who played Moses in the Ten Commandments. I've forgotten his name at the moment. He's died relatively recently of dementia. You can probably remember his name. But A Man for All Seasons, it's the story of Thomas More's long battle with Henry VIII over the question of how far the monarch can demand that his servants go. And the last line, of course, is the famous, "I die, the king's good servant, but God's first," and they chopped off his head. It's a brilliant movie from that point of view. Character laid out. And the guy who wrote the script, Bolt, as far as I know, was not a Christian, but he understood what was at stake. And that's certainly a top movie in our family. There aren't many. I mean, there are others that we like to watch because they have connections for us. Like there's a lovely movie of what's it called now? I've got name block, but it's set in with the Bush people in South Africa, in Namibia, and it opens up as though it's a National Geographic travel thing, but it's a lovely movie, and we all enjoyed it because it contains so much of Africa that we like and enjoy. So I've currently got name block for it, but it'll come back in a minute. But it shows you that the Shakespeare movies I will watch because they're rich. The very fact that ordinary working people could go to the Globe Theatre and join in what Shakespeare was writing in Henry V. Of course, Kenneth Branagh's Henry V is also one that you can show to your children. Brilliantly done, and a wonderful piece of artistic license in what they sing at the end. So, yeah, there's a problem there. I mean, my grandchildren all love watching Star Wars forever, so in our basement here, there's actually an old, VHS Star Wars that the kids go down the basement and we won't hear from them for an hour or more as they watch Star Wars yet again, we've loved the Jane Austen movies and the classic movies of that sort. The Hardy movies. There's plenty. Not the Hardy Boys, the Thomas Hardy movies. So the classics of all sorts are, from my point of view, worth watching, especially if you've got great actors doing them and you see what they can do with language. And there's much more in terms of what you can watch on YouTube and the like. There's remarkable stuff out there now. How long before they filter it out, I don't know, but I haven't been making a list, and I should do that. So, I haven't answered your question, except that once you're aware of how great the problem is, resist the chop it all down one, because that's just going to antagonize your children. And how old are they? Well, how old's the oldest now?
9642, so 9.
9642. So, yeah, you've got to get them on your side. That's your game. When we came to Canada and Joanna went to school and came back crying after her first day in middle school, and saying to Sally, who fortunately it was home, "Are you and Daddy going to divorce?" Because the first 6 kids she talked to in middle school all came from broken families. Now, your kids would be horrified at the thought of divorce, but it's roughly 50%, isn't it? And when you think what proportion of America is now just shacking up, how you find the narratives that can help them come to terms with that and other things, that I'm not so good at, and I need to work much more at that. I haven't kept up with modern novelists other than Michael O'Brien. If you haven't read Michael O'Brien, you must start at some point. Island of the World. How many people from your church come for an evening with you? Get a copy of Island of the World. I'd be very surprised if you can't find one who's got the genes, so to speak, for loving a great story. They will not be able to put it down, and they will enthuse the rest, and you will raise their level of reading. I've used that novel many times with people who I found reading trashy novels and saying, look, you can do better than that. Wendell Berry would be the other one that you could easily use, given where you're in the States. And the Wendell Berry Port William novels, they're actually an elegy for the death of Christianity in the Western world, without being written elegically, but not in a nasty fashion, just in a very sad fashion. Read Watch With Me first, because it's funny, but it raises all sorts of issues. And if you ever have a church retreat and you have a talent night, you can always read the second chapter, especially if there's a considerable group of teetotalers in the church. It's hilariously funny, and it's set in Prohibition times. I won't spoil it for you. So those would do. I have to go along my list shelves now, because I've been sorting out my N,000 books and finding a few that I'd forgotten I'd got and that I need to reread.
Thank you, Dr. John. Thank you guys all for listening. If you enjoyed this, please like on YouTube, make a comment if you'd prefer, and leave a comment and review us on the podcast app of your choice. With that being said, thank you guys again so much, and we'll see you next week.